Ward 7 of Mercy General was supposed to be a place of healing. Soft, beeping monitors. The faint smell of antiseptic. The low hum of a building that existed purely to keep people alive. For Julie Lewis, it had been something rarer than medicine. It had been safe. For 6 days, nobody could touch her. For 6 days, she slept without flinching in the shadows. She had even smiled at the night nurse, a small, fragile thing, like a woman finally remembering what peace felt like after 3 years of forgetting. She was sitting up in her bed, barefoot, her dark hair still tangled from sleep, her white hospital gown the only armor she had ever been allowed to wear, when the door at the end of the corridor exploded open. She didn't need to see his face. She knew his footsteps. She had memorized the particular weight of his rage the way a soldier learns the sound of incoming fire, not to understand it, but to survive it. Michael. He moved through that hospital corridor like a force of nature that had learned to wear a man's body. 6 feet 3 inches of shaved muscle packed into a tight black t-shirt, his wide, aggressive stride scattering everything in his path, a rolling IV stand sent crashing, plastic bottles of saline exploding like grenades against the linoleum, tubing whipping through the air as he closed the distance between them in seconds. Julie was already screaming before his hand locked around her arm. The grip was iron, absolute, the grip of a man who had never once been told no and allowed it to stand. "You thought you could hide from me?" His jaw was set, his eyes burning with that terrifying particular madness. She knew better than her own reflection that look that said she was not a person to him. She was property. She was his, and he had come to collect. She dug her bare toes into the cold floor. She scratched, she twisted. The IV ripped from her arm, and blood bloomed across the white of her gown like a flower opening too fast. A passing medical cart exploded sideways. An overhead light flickered and buzzed as her shoulder slammed the wall. None of it mattered. He was still pulling her forward, toward the exit, toward the dark, and not a single person in that corridor moved to stop him. Until the shadows at the far end of the hallway shifted. It was subtle, the way truly dangerous things always are. A stillness first, then a presence, then a figure, stepping unhurried and immaculate from the darkened alcove where the corridor bent, stepping directly into the cold wash of the fluorescent lights, as though he owned every particle of light and dark in this building. He did. Hong Bong. He was lean and precise, in a way that made every other man in the corridor look unfinished. A perfectly tailored all-black suit over a dark shirt, not a single crease out of place, both hands resting with impossible calm in his trouser pockets. His face was sharp, composed, almost academic, the way a man looks when he is solving a problem he has already solved 100 times before. His eyes found Michael immediately, his lips curved into the faintest smile, not the smile of a man about to fight, the smile of a man watching the last domino begin to fall. Michael felt it before he understood it, that primitive animal signal that fires in the spine before the brain catches up. He turned. He saw Hong Bong standing there, perfectly still in his path, and something shifted behind his eyes. The rage faltered. For the first time in 3 years, the hand gripping Julie's arm hesitated. Because Michael was a predator. He understood predators. And every instinct he had was now screaming that he had just dragged his prey directly into the territory of something infinitely more lethal than himself. Hong Bong tilted his head, very slightly, and spoke one word. One word, low, conversational, almost polite, the kind of word that doesn't raise its voice because it is never needed to. And in that single syllable, Michael's entire world began to end. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is reaching. The word Hong Bong spoke was a name, not Michael's name, something older than that, something in Korean low and precise, the way a surgeon names the instrument he needs next. And from the darkness behind him, 2 men materialized on either side of the corridor like they had been part of the wall this entire time, waiting only for permission to exist. Michael's grip on Julie's arm didn't loosen, not yet, but his body told the truth his face was trying to hide, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted. The reflexive posture of a man who has always solved problems with his size, recalibrating in real time against a problem his size could not solve. "You need to walk away," Michael said. His voice was still steady. "A performance. This is between me and her. This doesn't have anything to do with you." Hong Bong considered this the way a man considers a weather forecast mildly interesting, ultimately irrelevant to his plans. He took one step forward, unhurried, his dress shoes making a single, clean sound against the linoleum. "She is in my hospital," he said. "Everything inside this building has something to do with me." The words landed like a door closing in a sealed room. Julie felt the shift in Mikhail's hand, a fractional tightening, the instinct of a man gripping something harder right before he loses it. She had felt that grip her whole life. She knew exactly what it meant. She drove her elbow backward into his ribs with everything she had. It was not enough to free her. It was not meant to be. It was only meant to be a distraction, and it worked, because in the half-second that Michael's attention snapped down to her, Hong Bong moved. He did not run. He did not lunge. He simply closed distance with the efficiency of someone who had long ago decided that urgency and panic were two different things. His right hand came out of his pocket, caught Michael's wrist at a specific angle, and applied pressure to a point that turned 230 pounds of muscle into a problem of geometry rather than strength. Mikhail's hand released Julie's arm. His body folded at the elbow like a question mark, and the sound that came out of his mouth was not rage, it was surprise, which was so much more satisfying. Julie stumbled forward. One of Hong Bong's men caught her by the shoulders before she hit the floor, firm hands, not cruel ones, and steadied her without a word. Michael straightened, his face cycling through disbelief and fury in rapid succession. He rolled his wrist. He looked at the lean man in the black suit who had just redirected his body with the apparent effort of turning a page, and something very old and very animal in his brain began assembling the correct picture of where he was standing. "You have 30 seconds, Hong Bong said pleasantly, "before my security team arrives and the question of what to do with you becomes considerably more complicated. I suggest you use them." He was not looking at Michael anymore. He had already turned, was already assessing Julie, her torn gown, the blood tracking down her forearm from the ripped IV, her bare feet on the cold floor. His expression did not change, but his eyes moved over her the way a man reads a document he intends to act on. Mikhail took a step toward him. The two men in the corridor moved, not fast, not dramatically, just forward, and something about the particular quality of how they moved stopped Mikhail's foot mid-air. He understood men who fought out of anger. He understood men who fought for money. He had never in his life stood in front of men who might fight simply because they had been positioned there and were waiting for the word. It was a different category of dangerous entirely. The sound of security boots on the stairwell echoed up through the floor. Mikhail looked at Julie one last time. His eyes said everything his mouth didn't. "This isn't over. You belong to me. I will find you again," the full scripture of 3 years written into a single look. Hong Bong stepped into his eyeline, deliberately, blocking the look the way you'd close a blind. When the security team rounded the corridor 30 seconds later, they found a large man with his hands raised and a woman in a hospital gown being walked, very carefully, in the opposite direction. Julie had been in expensive places before. Mikhail had taken her to them sometimes, early on, when the relationship still wore its good mask restaurants with menus that had no prices, hotel suites with views that cost more per night than her rent. She had learned, eventually, that expensive places with Michael were just cages with better lighting. She did not know what to make of a place that was expensive and quiet, and for the first time she could measure contained no version of him at all. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building in the city's financial district, 41 stories above the street noise and the ordinary world. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. Furniture that was dark and precise, and somehow conveyed the impression that every object in the room had been chosen by someone who did not make careless decisions. There were no decorative flourishes, no excess, just quality, compressed and deliberate, the way Hong Bong himself seemed to take up space. A woman named Sun, small and efficient with close-cropped hair and an expression that disclosed nothing, had met them at the elevator. She had taken Julie's bloody arm, cleaned and dressed the wound from the torn IV with practiced quiet, and produced clothing from somewhere soft, dark trousers, a gray fitted top, thick socks without being asked and without comment, as though anticipating need was simply the minimum standard of professionalism here. Julie would later understand that Sun's professionalism extended considerably further than meals and clothing, that the close-cropped hair and the quiet efficiency were the surface of something considerably more, trained. Julie sat on the edge of a low couch and stared at the city spread below her. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and watched the lights and tried to locate the feeling she was supposed to be feeling. Gratitude, maybe. Or relief. Or fear a new kind. The kind that came with understanding you had been moved from one powerful man's control to another's without being consulted. She heard him before she saw him. The quiet sound of a door, the particular quality of a room changing when Hongbong entered it. He crossed to the window without speaking and stood beside her, not close, a careful distance looking at the same view. He had removed his jacket. The dark shirt underneath was pressed. Immaculate. He held 2 glasses and set one on the low table in front of her. "Water," he said, before she could ask. "You haven't had anything since this morning, according to the nursing notes." She looked at him. "You read my nursing notes. It's my hospital." She didn't touch the glass. "You said that back there, that it was your hospital." "Yes? What does that mean, exactly?" He turned from the window and sat in the chair across from her, not the couch, the chair, maintaining the distance with the same deliberateness with which he did everything. He looked at her steadily. "It means the building, the staff, the equipment, and the records are all under a holding company I control. It means Michael walked into a facility where every camera, every exit, and every security rotation answers to me." He paused. "It means he was never going to leave with you." Julie absorbed this, her hands pressed harder against her thighs. "You were there tonight, in that corridor. You weren't passing through." "No." "Why?" Something shifted behind his eyes, not evasion, but calibration, the look of a man deciding how much of the truth to dispense and in what order. "I was meeting with a member of my staff on the 4th floor. I became aware of the disturbance." He watched her. "That is the short answer. And the long answer is something we will have time for." He stood. "Tonight you sleep. There is a room prepared for you. The door locks from the inside. Sun will be outside if you need anything." He moved toward the hallway and then paused without turning. "You are not a prisoner here, Miss Lewis. The exits are not locked. I am not Mikhail." He said the name the way someone names a thing they intend to take apart. "But I would recommend, for the immediate future, that you stay." He left. Julie sat alone in 41 stories of careful, expensive quiet, and for the first time in 3 years, she slept through the night without waking once. Michael had been arrested and processed and released within 6 hours. The hospital had pressed no formal charges, a decision made somewhere above the level of the attending physician, somewhere that operated with the kind of quiet authority that never appeared in any paperwork. A caged man was a contained problem. A free man, stripped of everything that allowed him to stand, was a lesson. Hongbong had never been interested in cages. He had walked out of the precinct at 2 a.m. with his wrist still tender and his pride in a condition that would take considerably longer to heal. He did not understand, yet, what had been set in motion. By the time he was unlocking the door to his apartment, the first piece had already moved. A server in the Cayman Islands that hosted a specific series of financial accounts that technically did not exist under Mikhail's name, but that every person who mattered knew belonged to him, had experienced what the automated system flagged as an anomalous access event. The accounts were not emptied, nothing so obvious. They were simply noted, photographed, catalogued, the way a collector notes a piece before the auction, by 4 a.m. A man who ran street-level collections for a loan operation in the East Quarter, a man who had been quietly extending Michiel significant credit for the better part of 2 years, on the understanding that Michiel's particular reputation was collateral enough, received an anonymous document. The document contained a precise and accurate accounting of every dollar Michel owed. cross-referenced with a series of transactions that demonstrated, fairly conclusively, that Michael had been servicing a competing debt with money this man believed was earmarked for him. The man made 3 calls before sunrise. Hong Bong made none. He did not need to. He had people for the calls, people for the documents, people who understood that the most efficient demolition of a man's life happened not through violence, but through the surgical removal of every structure that allowed him to stand. He was eating breakfast congee, black tea, the newspaper physical and folded when Sun brought him the morning report on a slim tablet and set it beside his cup without comment. He read it with the expression of a man reviewing routine correspondence. Michael's primary income source had been suspended pending investigation. His landlord, who happened to bank with an institution where Hong Bong sat on an advisory board, had received a notification about an irregularity in the lease agreement. The gym where Michael trained, which also served as the informal office where he conducted his less legitimate business, had been contacted by the city's licensing authority about an unresolved zoning compliance issue. None of it was irreversible. None of it was, on its own, catastrophic. Together, it was the beginning of a man's world becoming unfamiliar to him. Doors that had always opened beginning to stick. Rooms he had always owned beginning to feel borrowed. Hong Bong folded the tablet and returned to his newspaper. 41 floors below, the city moved on, unknowing. The bag had been in the closet of her hospital room since she'd arrived. Julie had packed it the night she left. Really left. The last time, the time she had promised herself, was different from every other time she'd packed and unpacked and been pulled back. She had grabbed it from under the bed in the 40 seconds between him going to the bathroom and the front door. Clothes, her ID, her bank card, the small framed photo of her mother that she'd kept hidden inside a coat pocket for 2 years because anything visible became a weapon in his hands eventually. She had not unpacked it properly, not even in the penthouse, across 3 days of careful, quiet, and Sun appearing with meals, and Hong Bong appearing for brief, measured conversations that felt like weather systems significant, impossible to ignore, gone before she fully understood them. She had pulled out the clothes she needed and left the rest undisturbed at the bottom of the bag. Sun had retrieved it from the hospital the morning after, quietly, without mention, the way Sun did most things. It had appeared on Julie's bedroom chair sometime during the first day, as though it had always been there, the way you leave the last item in a first aid kit because using it means admitting the emergency is real. It was on the 4th morning that she found it. She was looking for the photo of her mother. She upended the bag onto the bed, sorted through the contents methodically, and there it was, tucked inside the pocket of the jacket she'd grabbed last, a small matte black drive the size of her thumbnail. It took her a moment to recognize the jacket. It wasn't hers. It was the one she had grabbed from the hook by his door in the dark. In the 40 seconds she had to run, the one she had mistaken for her own in her panic. Whatever was on the drive, she had never been meant to take it. She had simply run too fast for him to stop her. She sat with it in her palm for a long time. It had Michael's fingerprints all over it conceptually, even before she plugged it into the laptop Sun had wordlessly produced for her 2 days ago. She knew it the same way she had learned to know everything about him, not through evidence but through the particular shape of his desperation, the specific quality of his need to get her back. It had never felt, even at the worst of it, like the need of a man who missed her. It had felt like the need of a man who had lost something and was using her face as the place he kept looking. She plugged in the drive. The files loaded slowly. Spreadsheets, transaction records, dates and figures and names she half recognized from the edges of conversations she'd been supposed to not be listening to. Numbers that were large enough to make her breath go shallow. And at the bottom of the directory, a single folder labeled with a name she recognized as the man Michel had owed, for years, a debt that he had always spoken about in the careful way people speak about things that frighten them. She understood, sitting there with the cold light of the screen on her face, that she had not been running from a man who loved her badly. She had been running from a man who needed her to be retrievable, because whatever was on this drive was the only thing standing between him and people who made Hong Bong's world look straightforward. She was still sitting there when the knock came at the door. She closed the laptop. "Come in," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. Hong Bong opened the door and stopped. He read her face the way he read everything, quickly, completely, without telegraphing what he found. His gaze dropped to the laptop, then to the drive still inserted in its port, then back to her. He crossed the room and sat in the chair by the window, the same careful distance he always maintained, and waited. She pulled the drive out and held it up between them. "This was in my bag," she said. "I think this is why he came." Hong Bong looked at it. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite surprise, more like the confirmation of a theory he had already formed and set aside to be verified. He reached across the space between them, not taking the drive, just waiting. She placed it in his palm. He turned it over once. "How much did you look at?" "Enough." She watched him. "He owes money to people. Dangerous people. This is the proof." "Yes. And if those people had this proof, they would have leverage over him that would make his current situation significantly more precarious." Hong Bong set the drive on the table between them. He needed it back. "You were the only person who could have taken it, even unknowingly." Julie looked at the drive. Such a small thing. Smaller than her thumbnail. 3 years of her life, compressed. "He was never coming for me," she said, and was surprised by how level her voice stayed. "He was coming for that." Hong Bong was quiet for a moment. "Both things can be true," he said, and she looked up at him. "Men like Michael don't distinguish between what they want and what they need." "You were both," to him. He paused. "That doesn't make it more acceptable. It makes it more dangerous." She looked at him for a long time. He met her eyes without looking away, without the calculation she expected, with something she didn't quite have a name for yet. "What do you do with it now?" she asked. The corner of his mouth moved, barely. "Something useful," he said. That evening, Sun appeared in Julie's doorway and set the drive on the bedside table without a word. It looked identical to the one Julie had handed across the room hours earlier. It was not. Hong Bong had already taken what he needed from it, and what he had put back in its place was considerably more useful to him than the original. The days between settled into a shape she hadn't expected. Not comfortable exactly, but structured, which was its own form of relief. Meals at regular hours. Sun, appearing and disappearing like punctuation. Hong Bong, present in the way that serious weather is present. Not always visible, but always felt. On the 12th day, Julie walked out of her room at 11 at night and found Hong Bong standing at the floor-to-ceiling window with a glass of something dark in his hand, looking at the city below with the expression of a man conducting a silent inventory. She had not been able to sleep. The nightmares had been better, less frequent, less vivid, but tonight something had clawed its way back up. She had lain in the dark for 2 hours before the 4 walls of the room began to feel like something they weren't. She stood at the edge of the living space in her socks and the gray top and said nothing. He turned at the sound of her, assessed her quickly, and then turned back to the window without comment. The specific quality of silence that was not indifference, but was instead the offer of company, without the demand for explanation. She crossed the room and stood beside him. The city was spread below them, glittering and indifferent, full of ordinary people in ordinary apartments living lives with ordinary proportions. She had wanted that once. She had been fairly certain, 6 months ago, that she would never have anything again. "I have been thinking," she said. "That seems likely," he said, which was not what she expected. And she felt something loosen in her chest, the surprised beginning of something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "I've been thinking that I don't know anything about you," she said. "You know everything about me. You had my nursing notes. You have the drive. You've been—" she gestured, a small motion that was meant to contain the entire preceding 12 days. "Whatever you've been doing to his life, and I don't know who you are." Hong Bong was quiet. He turned the glass slowly in his hand. "You know what I am," he said. "That's not the same thing." He considered this with the seriousness he applied to everything. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her. "What do you want to know? Why you stayed?" She said, "In that corridor. You said you were meeting with staff. You could have had your security handle it and kept walking, but you came yourself." She watched him. "Why?" The city lights moved across his face. He was still for a long time, not evasively, but with the stillness of a man forming something precise rather than something fast. "I have controlled many things in this city," he said finally. "Buildings, accounts, people who owe me things. I have moved pieces on a board for long enough that I stopped noticing individual pieces." He paused. "And then I turned a corner in my own corridor and saw a woman fighting a man twice her size with nothing except her elbow and the willingness to try, and I—" He stopped. Something crossed his face that was private and brief and gone before she could name it. "I noticed," he said quietly. Julie stood with that for a moment. "That's not a safe thing to tell someone in my position," she said. "That you noticed me." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Because someone in my position might think that's a reason to trust you. And I've had reasons to trust people before." He turned to face her fully. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust me. Trust is something that accumulates over time, and we have had 12 days. His eyes were direct, without performance. "I'm asking you to stay in this building until the threat to your life is resolved, and to let me resolve it. What comes after that is entirely your choice." He paused. "It will always be your choice. That is the only promise I will make, because it's the only one I can guarantee." Julie looked at him. The city was behind him, 41 stories of light and distance, and she was standing in her socks with 12 days of someone else's careful hospitality wrapped around her like borrowed clothes. She had come here with nothing. A bag, a drive she didn't know she had, and the particular brand of exhaustion that 3 years of surviving someone leaves in the bones. She had not come here expecting to feel like a person again. She had not come here expecting to feel anything except the temporary relief of a locked door. "I'll stay," she said. Not because the door was locked, not because the city was 41 stories down, but because she had watched him, for 12 days, to keep every quiet thing he had said he would keep, and because the promise he had just made was the first promise anyone had ever offered her that was shaped like space rather than walls. Hong Bong nodded once. He turned back to the window. They stood together in the quiet, the city below them indifferent and enormous and full of a man who was beginning, street by street and dollar by dollar, to understand that he had made the last mistake of his particular life. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. Neither of them needed to. It started with her hands. Hong Bong had noticed them first, the way she held them, slightly curled, close to her body, the unconscious posture of someone who had learned that hands left open and visible were hands that could be grabbed. He had said nothing about it for the first week. He was a patient man. He understood that certain habits lived in the body rather than the mind, and the body required a different kind of conversation. He cleared the furniture from the center of the penthouse's secondary room on a Tuesday morning, and was already standing in the middle of the empty floor when Julie came looking for Sun and found him instead. He was not in his suit. Dark training clothes, no jacket, sleeves pushed to the elbow. It was the most undone she had ever seen him, and somehow it made him look more dangerous. Not less the suit, she realized, was armor of a kind. A layer of civilization over something considerably more elemental. "You don't have to," he said, before she could speak. "But the offer is there." She looked at the cleared floor. She looked at him. "I don't know how to fight," she said. "Not yet," he said. She had expected she didn't know what she had expected. Something aggressive, perhaps. Something that moved fast and demanded the same in return. What he gave her instead was slow and almost meditative, like he was teaching her a language rather than a skill. Stand here. Wait here. When something comes at you from this direction, your body wants to do this, and that is wrong, and here is why, and here is what to do instead. He never touched her without asking first. That was the thing she noticed and kept noticing, kept turning over in her mind in the quiet afterward. "May I move your arm? I'm going to show you something with your wrist. Is that all right?" As though her body was a place that required an invitation. As though the concept of her own consent was something worth repeating until it became familiar again. She was not good at first. She was stiff and self-conscious, and twice she flinched away from a slow, telegraphed demonstration and was humiliated by the flinching in a way she couldn't entirely explain. He registered it both times and continued without comment, without pity, without the particular performative patience that would have felt like condescension. He simply waited until she reset and then continued from exactly where they had stopped, as though the pause had been entirely ordinary. By the second week she was arriving before him, she would push the chairs back herself and stand in the middle of the cleared floor in her training clothes, working through the sequences alone, the footwork, the redirection, the specific geometry of making a larger body's force work against itself rather than through her. She found, in the repetition, something she had not expected to find. Not confidence exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it. The first cells of a thing that would eventually be confidence, dividing slowly in the dark. Hong Bong would arrive and watch her for a moment from the doorway before he stepped in, and she pretended not to notice the way he watched, and he pretended not to know she was pretending. And this small shared fiction was its own kind of intimacy. One evening, 2 weeks in, she got the wrist redirection right, genuinely right, with the correct weight and timing, and his grip released, and he stepped back and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Uncalculated, briefly, fully open. "Again," he said, and his voice was not quite level. She did it again, and again. And on the fourth repetition she felt it, the click of a thing that had previously been instruction becoming instinct, and she looked up at him with something igniting behind her eyes that was new and electric in hers. He was smiling. Not the cold smile from the corridor, not the composed half-smile he wore in the world. Something smaller and more private, something that lived in the corners rather than the center. "There," he said quietly. "There you are." She looked away first, because the alternative was looking at him for too long, and she was not ready for what that meant yet. But she was smiling too, and she didn't try to hide it. And the room felt different for the rest of the evening, charged and warm, and full of the particular electricity of two people, discovering they are more visible to each other than they intended to be. Michael had been reduced, and he knew it. He knew it the way an animal knows the edge of its territory has contracted not through reason, but through a series of encounters with walls where there had been open ground, numbers that no longer answered, rooms that no longer opened, men who had called him by his first name for years, who now took a beat too long before picking up the phone. He sat in the back of a bar in the West Quarter that was not his usual bar, in a neighborhood that was not his neighborhood, across from a man named Drez who wore too many rings and had the flat, patient eyes of someone who had waited out many situations and would wait out many more. Drez represented a particular faction of the city's underground who had been in quiet conflict with Hong Bong's operation for the better part of 3 years, not open war. But the kind of sustained territorial friction that expressed itself in missing shipments and inconvenient audits and the occasional disappearance of a mid-level operative, they had been looking for an angle. They had been waiting for the right piece of leverage to move against a man who had, thus far, been remarkably resistant to the kind of pressure they knew how to apply. He had sent someone for it, a courier he used when things needed to move without a name attached. It had arrived at his door in a plain envelope 2 days after his release. No note, no sender. He had not questioned it. He had been too desperate to question it. He did not know, and would not know until it was far too late, that the drive he held had never left Hong Bong's control at all. Michiel put the drive on the table. Drez looked at it without touching it. "That's the ledger?" "Everything," Michael said. "His accounts, his facility ownership, the names of every official in this city on his payroll. You put that in front of the right people, his entire operation folds from the inside." He paused. "And I want the woman." Drez picked up the drive, turned it over, set it back down. "The woman," he said, with the mild curiosity of a man repeating a word in a foreign language. "She comes with me, unharmed. That's the condition." Drez looked at him with the flat eyes for a long moment. Then he pocketed the drive and picked up his glass and drank from it slowly, and the unhurried quality of the gesture told Michael everything he needed to know about what his conditions were worth. "We'll be in touch," Dres said. They were in touch 3 days later. There were logistics approaches, timing, the specific architecture of a building that, it turned out, Dres's people had been mapping for longer than Michael had known the building existed. A date, a number of men, a method of entry that involved the service infrastructure of the building's lower floors and would leave the primary security systems technically unbreached while making them operationally irrelevant. Michael sat in the planning meeting and understood, with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, that he was not a partner in this operation. He was a detail, a key that Dres needed to turn a specific lock, after which the key would be set aside. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself that what mattered was getting into that building, getting to her, getting back what had been his. He had been telling himself versions of this story for so long that he had lost the ability to hear how it sounded. He was the last person in the room to understand that the story was ending. The alarm was a sound Julie had never heard before, not the sharp civilian shriek of a fire alarm, but something lower and more serious. A tone that seemed to vibrate in the architecture itself, rather than come from any single source. She sat up in the dark and was on her feet before she was fully awake, the training doing what training was designed to do. Sun was already at her door when she opened it. Not panicked. Sun was constitutionally incapable of panicked, Julie had concluded, but moving with a compressed urgency that was more alarming than any visible fear would have been. "Service entrance on 12, Sun said, already walking. 8 men, possibly more. Mr. Hong is aware. Where is he? Coordinating. Come." The penthouse was different at night, in an emergency, the ambient low light replaced by something cooler and more operational. And people she had seen only peripherally over the past weeks were now moving through it with a focused efficiency that revealed what they actually were. Not staff. Not exactly. Men and women who had been living in this building the same way the security detail lived in it, performing ordinary functions as a secondary occupation to whatever their primary one was. Sun led her toward the interior room, the room with no exterior windows, reinforced, designated for exactly this eventuality. Julie stopped in the hallway. "I'm not going in there," she said. Sun turned. "Miss Lewis, I understand what that room is," Julie said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. "I understand why it exists. I'm not going in it." Sun looked at her for a moment with something that might, on another face, have been approval. "Mr. Hong will not be pleased." "Mr. Hong can take it up with me afterward," Julie said. And something about the sentence, its ordinary, grounded confidence, landed in her chest like something solid taking root. She went to the training room. She pushed the chairs back herself, automatic now, and stood in the center of the cleared floor in her socks and her dark clothes, and she breathed the specific breathing Hong Bong had taught her, the kind that narrowed the world to the immediate and made the immediate manageable. Below her, she could feel the building in a way she hadn't before, not literally, but in the way that a place you have inhabited for weeks becomes an extension of your awareness. She knew which sounds were normal and which weren't. She heard the elevator shaft active on a floor it shouldn't be active on. She heard the difference between footsteps that belonged here and footsteps that didn't. She heard, eventually, the sound of one set of footsteps that she knew better than her own. The door of the training room opened. Michael filled the frame. He was breathing hard, not from fear, from effort, from whatever it had taken to get from the service entrance on 12 to the 41st floor, while Hong Bong's people were actively managing the building. Later, Julie would learn that 2 of Hong Bong's men had let him through the last corridor deliberately, on instruction because Hong Bong had wanted Michael to arrive exactly where he arrived, and find exactly what he found. His black t-shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was blood on his forearm that she didn't think was his. He looked, for the first time in 3 years, like a man who had been in a real fight rather than conducting one. He saw her standing in the center of the cleared floor, and something moved across his face that was not what she expected. Not triumph, not the familiar cold satisfaction she had catalogued and dreaded. Something rawer than that. Something that might, in another man, have been recognized as grief, the grief of a person who has pursued a thing so far past the point of reason that the pursuit has become the only self they have left. "Julie," he said. His voice was different. She noticed that and filed it away. "You need to leave," she said. He almost laughed, a short, broken sound. "I need the drive." "I know." "Then you know why I'm here. Give it to me, and I walk away. You never see me again." He took a step into the room. "I know you don't believe that, but I'm not here for what you think. I just need—" "I know exactly what you need," she said. "And I know what it would cost me. So no." He took another step. Old instinct spiked up her spine, the urge to step back, to make herself smaller, to find the fastest path to a wall she could put behind her. She felt it arrive and she let it pass through her, the way Hongbong had taught her, not suppressed, not denied, just acknowledged and released, because the body's fear was information and not instruction. She moved her weight forward instead of back. She widened her stance. Something flickered in Michael's eyes. "Don't," he said, and it was almost gentle, and that gentleness was the most frightening version of him she had ever encountered, because she knew what it cost and what it covered. He crossed the room fast, large and fast, the way he had always moved when decision had been made, with the particular certainty of a man who had never genuinely been stopped by anything his own size or smaller. She was not his size, but she had been taught by someone who had spent years studying the difference between size and force, and who had understood, before Julie did, that they were not the same thing. She moved to his outside, the way she'd practiced. His reaching arm passed over her shoulder instead of closing around it. She got her hand on his wrist at the point Hongbong had shown her, and she pulled in the direction he was already moving, adding to his momentum rather than opposing it. And 230 pounds of Michael became a problem that gravity was suddenly very interested in. He hit the floor hard. Not a fall, a landing, loud and disorienting, and she stepped back and reset before he'd fully processed what had happened. He was up faster than she expected. He always was, but she had bought herself the most important thing, the thing that had never been available in 3 years of the other version of this. She had bought herself a moment in which he looked at her differently, in which the category she occupied in his understanding shifted, fractionally, irreversibly. He came at her again, and this time there was less certainty in it, which made him more unpredictable, and she felt the difference and adjusted. And she was in the process of adjusting when his sheer size made the geometry wrong, and his hand caught her forearm, and she felt herself losing the angle. The door of the training room opened. Hongbong stepped in. He was not rushed. He was not loud. He assessed the room in approximately 1 second. Julie's arm in Mikhail's grip, the cleared floor, the two of them in the particular configuration that told him everything he needed to know about what had already happened before he arrived. He looked at Julie first, a question in his eyes, a quick and complete one. She gave him the smallest nod. "I'm all right. I had him. I just need—" He crossed the room. What followed was not a fight in the way that word is usually meant. A fight implies uncertainty, implies two forces of comparable weight contending for an outcome that could go either way. What Hongbong did to Mikhail in the next 2 minutes was something closer to a proof, a systematic, precise, and absolute demonstration of a principle, the principle being that physical dominance, real dominance, had never been about size. He dismantled Michael the way he dismantled everything methodically, without waste, without the performance of anger. Each movement was specific and deliberate, and addressed a different layer of the structure Mikhail had built his entire sense of self upon. His reach, his balance, his certainty that the world was organized around his capacity to impose himself upon it. By the end of it, Michael was on the floor of the training room and he was not getting up. Not because he was physically incapable, he would be physically capable eventually, but because something in him had been reached and extinguished that no amount of recovery would relight. He lay there and looked at the ceiling, and there was nothing in his face anymore that was dangerous. There was only a man on a floor, at the end of something, and the specific emptiness that comes when the story you've been telling yourself for years finally runs out of words. Hongbong stepped back. He straightened his cuffs. He looked at Mikhail with the dispassionate assessment of a man who has resolved a problem and is already thinking about the next one. Then he turned to Julie. She was standing against the wall, not cowering against it, standing against it, upright, breathing, present. Her forearm would bruise where Michael had grabbed it. Her hands were loose at her sides, not curled. Hongbong looked at her for a long moment. "You were supposed to be in the interior room," he said. His voice was entirely level. "I know," she said. "Sun told you to go to the interior room." She did. He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression that was complicated and layered and entirely too large for the moment they were standing in. And he did what she had come to understand. He did with things that were too large for their immediate moment. He filed it, precisely, for later. "We'll discuss it," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "We will." Mikhail left the city 11 days later. Not in the way living people usually leave cities, not with a moving truck or a forwarded address or a series of small logistical considerations. He left in the way that men leave when the alternative has been made comprehensively clear to them by someone with the resources and the patience to make things clear without ever needing to raise his voice. His debts had been structured. The ledger had been deployed not publicly, not in any way that would attract the kind of attention that created complications, but specifically and surgically placed in the hands of exactly the people whose knowledge of its contents would make Mikhail's continued presence in this city a problem he could not survive. The men he had owed, the rival faction he had traded with. Drez, who had taken the drive and subsequently discovered that the drive contained exactly what Michiel had promised, and also a small, embedded tracking file that had been there since Hongbong's people had copied and replaced its contents weeks earlier. Drez's operation had other problems now. Michiel understood, by the end of the second week, that he had been not just defeated but archived, that everything he had done and owed and promised was now documented and held by a man who would deploy it the moment Michael's coordinates moved in the wrong direction. He was not imprisoned. He was not threatened with specificity. He was simply made to understand that he had exhausted every available option in this city, and that the continuation of his existence required him to find another one. He was seen at the airport on a Tuesday morning with a single bag, and the expression of a man who has swallowed something that will take a very long time to digest. He did not look back. Hongbong received the confirmation during breakfast and continued eating. He finished his tea. He read the last quarter of the newspaper. Then he folded it and set it aside with the clean finality of completing a chapter. And he sat for a moment in the quiet of the penthouse, with the city spread below him and something in his chest that was not quite peace, but was proximate to it. He went to find Julie. She was on the roof terrace when he found her a space she had discovered 2 weeks ago and had been returning to with increasing frequency, a long, planted terrace on the north side of the building with a wooden bench and the kind of view that made the city look, from sufficient altitude, like something orderly and manageable. She was sitting on the bench in the morning light with her legs folded under her and a cup of coffee in both hands, her dark hair loose, wearing the gray top and dark trousers that had become her default. And she looked. He stood at the terrace door and looked at her before she saw him. She looked settled, rooted, like a person who had located something in herself that was no longer contingent on the absence of threat. She heard the door and turned, and the look she gave him told him she already knew, at least partly. The particular quality of the morning, perhaps, or simply the fact that she had learned, over weeks of careful proximity, to read him with a fluency she hadn't consciously developed. "He's gone," she said. "Yes." She turned back to the city. She was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was turning something over and wanted to get it right before she spoke. "I don't know what I feel," she said. "I thought I would feel more relief or—" She paused. "I thought it would feel like a door closing, but it feels more like a weight that has been so present for so long that its absence is disorienting," Hongbong said quietly, "and that it will take time to learn how to stand without accounting for it." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." She studied his face. "You know that feeling." He crossed the terrace and sat beside her on the bench close. the first time the careful distance had been set aside, though neither of them named it. He looked at the city. "I have carried many things for a long time," he said. "Not all of them were mine to carry. It takes time to learn the difference." Julie was quiet. The morning light was doing something particular to the city below them, turning the glass of distant buildings gold and making the whole thing look, temporarily, like something almost innocent. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what comes next." She looked at her coffee. "I don't have an apartment. I don't have—" She almost laughed. "I have the clothes Son bought me, and a bruise on my forearm, and a working knowledge of wrist redirection, and a choice," he said. She looked at him. "I told you on the first night," he said. "It would always be yours." She searched his face. He let her did not compose himself into something more legible or more manageable, but sat with his face as it was, which was a more vulnerable act than anything she had watched him do in a room full of dangerous men. "What would it mean?" she asked. "Staying. Really staying. Not because there's a threat. Not because the door is—" She stopped, restarted. "What would it mean to you?" He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had asked something that had no answer. Then he looked at the city, and back at her, and he said, "It would mean that I stop working alone, that there is someone in this building who is here not because they owe me something or because I employ them, but because they choose to be." He paused. "It would mean I have to be worth choosing." He held her eyes. "I intend to be worth choosing." Julie sat with this. She turned the coffee cup in her hands, warm and solid and real, and she looked at the city that had been the backdrop to 3 years of her diminishment, and was now, this morning, just a city full of ordinary complexity, capable of being moved through, no longer synonymous with being trapped. She had come into this building with nothing except the remnants of herself. She had been put back together here, not by someone who had fixed her. She understood that the fixing had been hers, had always been hers, but by someone who had created the conditions in which the fixing was possible. Space, safety, patience, the repeated, quiet insistence that her choices were real and would be honored. She thought about the woman on the hospital floor in the white gown with the torn IV. She did not feel sorry for her. She felt something fiercer than that, a protective, grounded tenderness for the version of herself that had survived, that had kept going even when going meant being dragged. She had stopped running. She had not noticed exactly when it happened, but she had. "All right," she said. Hong Bong looked at her. "All right," she said again, steadier, like a person confirming coordinates. "I'll stay." Something crossed his face open, unguarded, gone quickly but not quickly enough. He looked at the city. He looked back at her. He turned his palm up on the bench between them, not reaching, not demanding, just offering. She looked at his hand for a moment. Then she put hers in it. Below them, the city moved on, indifferent and enormous, full of its ordinary emergencies and ordinary joys, full of people who would never know that on the 41st floor of a glass building in the financial district, a woman who had been told for 3 years that she was nothing, had chosen her own life with both eyes open and her hands uncurled. The morning light held them both. It was enough. It was, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, more than enough. But every ending is only a door, and somewhere in this city, someone has been watching, not Michael, not Drez, not anyone Julie has learned to fear yet. Someone who knows Hong Bong's name the way you know the name of something that once destroyed you. The next story begins where this one couldn't see. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because what's coming for them next will make everything that just happened look like the quiet before the storm. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello. And like this, if Julie and Hong Bong have already taken up permanent residence in your chest, because trust me, you are not ready for what is buried in his past. See you in the next one.